Ladies and gentlemen, dear IFA friends, I welcome you to the virtual room for the YIN seminar. But before moving to that part of the program, I shortly inform you on the poster sessions that will take place after the YIN seminar from 5 till 5:30 p.m. Central European Time. But now I'm wishing you welcome to an interesting YIN seminar. I'm glad to give the screen to the moderators of the YIN seminar, Claudia Suter and Michael Evers.
And live from Amsterdam, I welcome you to the 2020 YIN seminar. My name is Michael Evers, PSE representative for the Young IFA Network.
And here from Zurich in Switzerland, I'm the chair of the YIN committee, Claudia Suter, and I also welcome you to this YIN panel we have this afternoon, is 3 p.m. CET. We'll be discussing the ramifications of the current crisis from a future legal, from a future tax leaders' point of view. And there has been so much written about the measurements that governments have taken across the globe, but a little has been said so far from a forward-looking angle. What's going on, what's going to happen for the next generation. And the panelists at this YIN seminar will dare to look into the crystal ball to find out and discuss what may lie ahead of us. What will the tax policies look like? What may they be shaped? What will governments say in various parts of the world? How do businesses react, and how do tax advisors plan around the challenges that are ahead? And we've also conducted a survey in that context and shared them with YIN representatives and YIN members across the globe. And we had a huge number of turnout, and actually, not very surprisingly, over half of the YIN population believes that their generation is hit hardest by the current crisis. And also, not very surprisingly either, about 1/3 of the YIN population believes that the COVID-19 crisis will lead to more tax structuring. So we will see, or we expect to see, not only a lot of tax structuring ahead of us. That is quite good, because that means we'll be busy going forward. We'll be kept busy as tax advisors and as governments, as businesses taking measures. But at the same time, we also believe that we'll do that on a lower level than we currently are. But I don't want to spoil the discussion, and we'll have the future leaders share their views very shortly. And before we go into the discussion, I would also like to mention that we'll have polling questions popping up here and there. So please reply to them whenever they come up, and we'll be happy or pleased to see what your perspective is and what your view is. Also, there is a Q&A function and a chat function which you can use, and which will try to keep track of the developments. And I'm really happy that we have now this great panel here, and I'll leave them introduce themselves after. But first, we would like to celebrate the first prize winner, who is also participating in the YIN panel today. And for that, I hand over to Michael again.
Yeah, that's right, Claudia. We have something to celebrate. Mitchell B. Carroll was the first IFA president decades ago. And an annual prize is now awarded in his name to the best international tax thesis written by an author under 40. Now, Carroll played a huge role in the adoption of the so-called separate entity approach and the arm's length principle back in the early 1930s, when he was working for the League of Nations. And therefore, the winner of the 2020 Mitchell B. Carroll Prize is very appropriate. Because we go to Austria, and there is Raphael Holzinger, or I should say Dr. Holzinger. Congratulations. Your thesis analyzes the profit attribution under Article 7 and Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention. A very thick book you produced, around 500 pages. why this very tough topic, and what are the main findings that you can share with us, Raphael?
Thank you, Michael. Many thanks for the nice introduction. It is indeed a great pleasure to win such a prestigious prize, especially when the prize is awarded in the name of Mitchell B. Carroll, who was indeed a great pioneer of national tax, and especially of the topic of profit attribution. As briefly mentioned by you, my thesis analyzes both profit attribution provisions in the OECD model conventions from a very systematic perspective with a specific focus on a comparison of the provisions in light of the dogma of neutrality of legal forms in the OECD model convention. So the idea to my PhD thesis, which basically has a quite broad scope, essentially resulted from a rather specific problem in international taxation, namely the issue of single taxpayer approach on the one hand versus dual taxpayer approach on the other hand. When I first dealt with this problem, I was quite strongly convinced that the single taxpayer approach is to be seen as the dogmatically more sound interpretation of the problem. However, in order to back up my gut feeling conclusion, I had to carry out the very broad-scaled analysis of the profit attribution provisions, which eventually unveils that both provisions are based upon a so-called functional and factual arm's length understanding, meaning that the application of Article 7 and Article 9 at the end of the day should lead to the same result.
Very interesting. So on that last point also, because I wanted to ask you about some recommendations you also make to policymakers, but before going that too, what is your view? Is Article 9 of the Model Tax Convention, is that an illustrative article or a restrictive article?
And that's basically a quite tough one. But in general, I would say restrictive with a self-executing powers on the level of profit attribution, but without self-executing powers on the level of profit determination. So this is up to the local states at the end of the day.
Right. So in that light, what recommendations are you making in your thesis?
During the past decades, the arm's length principle or the arm's length understanding under Article 7 and Article 9 grew closer and closer together. With the implementation of the AOA in 2010, the ALP under Article 7 was already at that time more or less based on a functional and factual arm's length understanding, whereas the ALP under Article 9 formalistic. However, given the changes resulting from the OECD BEPS project regarding the interpretation of Article 9 of the OECD model, I also always say Article 9 was freed from his change of the formalistic attitude, and at the end of the day also developed to a more functional and factual understanding, meaning that now in the current OECD model, both provisions are based on the same ALP understanding. And based on that, since both provisions are based on the same arm's length understanding, I concluded that it would, at the end of the day, make sense to get rid of one of them in future. And in this respect, I have suggested some changes to the wording and the structure of the OECD Model Convention, according to which those parts of the two profit attribution provisions, which essentially deal with the profit attribution issue, can be merged at the end of the day.
So we leave that for the policymakers in Paris and, of course, the countries in the OECD. Now, if you're a tax practitioner, why should you read this book?
Thanks. Now I get some time to boost the sales of my book.
Exactly.
So, in fact, the PhD thesis deals with both, on the one hand, political suggestions for the future, and on the other hand, with an in-depth analysis of the dogmatic basis of the arm's length principle laid down in Article 7 and Article 9, starting in the 1920s up to now. So a very historic analysis and also a current analysis. In this respect, both the level of applicability and the level of application of the principles of profit attributions in the PE world, as well as in the associated enterprises world, was subject to a very detailed analysis. And accordingly, tax practitioners hopefully will find plenty of useful thoughts in the book, and when they, at the end of the day, have to deal with questions on whether a taxing right of a specific state exists, and which profits might eventually be attributable to a business unit located in those jurisdictions.
Well, I guess transfer pricing and also Article 7 are here to stay, at least for a while, maybe in an altered way, maybe following your recommendations, maybe influenced by Pillar 1. Well, let's see. I think for now, everybody dealing also with transfer pricing controversy can for sure look up your book as well. There's one problem, perhaps. It's written in German. But thank you very much for making an English summary available. Everybody can find that one in the Congress app. So thanks again for making that available. Also, if you as an audience want to win, provided you can read German, of course, want to win this copy that Raphael made available, there's a link also on the slide. It's also somewhere else in the IFA app where you can participate in a sweepstake, answer a question, leave your email address, and then have the chance to win this copy. If you want to be next year's winner of the Mitchell B. Carroll Prize, look up the conditions on the IFA website. That's ifa.nl, and hopefully we can congratulate one of you next year as the new prize winner. For now, congratulations again to Raphael, and that is then, I think, time to move on to the first panel discussion. Claudia.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Raphael, and congratulations again from my side as well.
Thank you.
Exactly. We're looking at the world today. What does the world look today in the various jurisdictions or in the various regions we cover in our panel? And we are actually very excited to have a great spread across the world when looking at our panelists. We are joined today by members from the government, from tax practitioners, academia, from various aspects of the tax practice today. And we'd like to hear what they're saying about the current status, about what's going on in their respective regions. So we'll do the journey across the globe from the south to the north, and we start with Lucas. He's joining us from Sao Paulo. He's the head of tax of eBanks. Thank you very much for being here and for attending this seminar. So what's the current situation in Brazil? And did you see already an impact on either the taxation environment in Brazil or internationally occurring? And how is it for you there?
Thank you, Claudia. Hello, everyone. So in Brazil, what happened since the beginning of the pandemic really was a lot of tax incentives were given by the government for companies to be able to survive the toughest parts of the pandemic and the quarantine effects. And we've seen Brazil moving closer and closer to more integration and coordination in international tax matters with the OECD and other countries, especially in the area of transfer pricing. So what we've seen, at least since March in Brazil, is tax authorities getting closer and closer to organizations, international organizations, to update Brazilian international tax laws. Tax incentives being offered to companies, especially companies that were struggling in the retail space and other very directly hurt areas of the economy. And I would say that currently, because all areas of government are facing a budget crisis due to the impact of COVID-19 in Brazil, I would say that it is very probable, and companies are expecting this, that in the very near future, we're going to see tax hikes. We're expecting those probably for the beginning of next year. Brazil is undergoing a discussion about tax reform regarding its consumption taxes. And that's another area in which Brazil is trying to align itself with the international global practice, especially the VAT practice worldwide. So I would say that for now, that's what we've been seeing. Obviously, the perspectives of different companies, and I come from the private sector, My company deals with payment processing. We're very much in the digital space. So the perspectives of different companies will be certainly different. If you heard from other people from different areas, they would say different things. But I would say that in general, we're going through a stage of tax incentives still operating in Brazil until the end of the year, perhaps the beginning of next year. But we expect that in the near future, because of the budget pressures that we've been seeing in Brazil and many other countries as well, in Brazil, we're going to see tax hikes, and perhaps that is going to be used as background for more integration regarding international tax practice and international tax law. We don't know at this stage, but that's essentially what's been happening in Brazil so far.
Thank you very much.
I think that we crossed the ocean, right, Claudio? So in Angola, in Luanda, we have Elisangela Akita. Hi, Elisangela. So you work for the Angolan authorities, as a matter of fact, as a tax treaty negotiator, one of the most fun jobs you can find in international tax, I would say, from personal experience. Thanks for joining us. What can you share from an Angolan or an African perspective, Elisangela?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michael. On our side, I would say that I would point out two of the main effects of this COVID pandemic era, besides the ones that we already know. I'd say on businesses, we saw different timings of how companies adapt to the changing, the dynamics and the needs for the digitalization to operate in a digital world, some faster, some definitely slower. But I would point out the blossoming and the promotion of certain sectors, such as delivery services, online services, social media, commerce, e-commerce, restaurants, and the food business in general. And also, there was I would risk in saying a boost in local production of goods, because mainly because of the government incentives created to prevent imports of non-essential goods, and the increase in demands due to border restrictions. So agriculture and manufacture really saw an incentive during this time. I prefer to point out the positive aspects of this crucial time. But also, and other sectors such as protection of medicines and hospital equipment and all those products. But on the other hand, what I think is a real issue that we should consider and think as Angola, as African countries, and maybe extended to some other developing countries, is that we should, in my opinion, rethink some of the concepts, because I believe that the pandemic brought light to the fact that not all measures are universal or universally applicable, depending on the context. For instance, what does the concept of stay home mean in a culture where the concept of family or home is much more extended, or not necessarily secluded to closed areas? So it was a cultural adaptation that we needed to see, because you wouldn't, people were told to stay home, but home has a very broad concept in an Angolan or cultural perspective, or African perspective, I'll say. The other thing is the fact that most of our economy, a good percentage of our economy, is still informal, and I'm speaking about mainly street vendors. And a good number of street vendors are women, especially in the food market, selling food. So these people were not, there was no accommodation for them during the lockdown. So there is no business at home if you're a street vendor. And so that just, I think it brings the debate between formal and versus informal. If most of your economy is informal, then maybe that is where the policies should be directed to, and not seen as it would be seen as a central rather than a marginal issue for policy making. And so it brought up these socioeconomic concerns and aspects that maybe were not seen in that especially as within the tax purposes, the tax measures that were implemented to deal with the COVID pandemic. Very broadly, that's what I would bring about.
This is really truly interesting because that gives us a totally different perspective from what the general discussion is about. Maybe if we change perspectives again, we jump the ocean again and go to Mahesh, who's tax advisor with Withers Kata Wong in Singapore. And Singapore is in that sense special because you were one of the jurisdictions that have been affected first by the COVID crisis, long before, or considerably before Europe or even the North and South American countries have been affected. And therefore, we would be interested to hear from you what's your perspective and your take on the current situation.
Yeah, you're right. So initially, when this whole thing started out, the situation was pretty bad. But the good thing is it's now under control. So I'm happy to say that we've actually gone through at least 8 days without any new local transmissions, and we're quite hopeful that we don't see a new wave, right? But there were lockdowns and the whole travel restrictions. It did impact the economy. There are industries like travel, hospitality, hotels, tourism. These are very important for Singapore's economy, and all of that has been hit pretty bad. The government did introduce various stimulus packages, and I think over almost $75 billion. And all of that has helped the country overcome this whole crisis. Now, it will take some time to go back to the whole pre-pandemic the levels, if one could say. But I think economic recovery has definitely started. So when you look at it from the standpoint of international tax planning, you have to note, Singapore's position in the world, right? So it is a major financial center, a huge trading hub. Singapore is also the regional headquarters for some of the world's largest corporations, a very popular holding company jurisdiction. So, so during these COVID lockdowns and where people were stranded all over the world in their respective home countries, there were so many Singapore-based companies. There was always this question of can they continue to establish residence in this kind of a world, right? So where your decision makers or your employees are stranded or in lockdown in some other country. Now, of course, there was some relief that the tax authorities did announce. But then apart from that, I think the whole risk arises in the other country. So Singapore companies having potential permanent establishments or places of management in countries where directors or employees are based. So all of that is creating a lot of confusion, and I think the lack of consensus, because this may require the world or some OECD-led efforts to ensure that I do know that many countries have provided some relief in terms with respect to permanent establishments or resident, but there are several gaps as well, right? So again, going back to Singapore, so I'm generally an optimist. I think Singapore will only get stronger in this whole post-COVID world. And we will definitely continue to see this trend of investment structures, holding structures, business, operating structures moving from the whole tax haven jurisdictions to countries like Singapore, where it is definitely more, it's easier to establish real economic substance. Singapore has even become a very important technology hub, probably one of the most important technology hubs outside Silicon Valley, right? And even you look at uncertainty surrounding countries like Hong Kong, right? So all of that has also pushed a lot of structures and companies to consider Singapore. And I think given Singapore's positioning in the whole global business or the investor community, I don't think the Singapore government is going to do anything radical or introduce any tax measure that will dent Singapore's attractiveness to investors. And again, Singapore is one of those countries that does not need to do it, right? So I think it's all a matter of ensuring that Singapore will continue to be competitive, and to see whether there are opportunities that have come out of this whole pandemic.
Thank you, Mahesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks also. Again, there was another relatively optimistic message, so it's always good to hear. And on your point, I think on the need for more guidance in international tax in the OECD, I think they're planning to come out with some additional guidance before the end of the year. But that's something that we will probably hear during the IFA OECD panel next week. Now, we are staying in Asia, but going to a totally different country, to India, where Anupa is joining us actually from Delhi, but she's normally with Deloitte in Mumbai with the Indian tax practice. Do you share a similar, or do you have a similar, relatively optimistic message for us, or do you have a totally different perspective, Anupa?
Thank you, Michael. So yeah, I would actually want to share an optimistic view of the situation. So in India, generally, I think now we are in a gradual unlock phase. So business activity has gradually started picking up again, compared to the complete lockdown and quarantines that were there in the initial part of the pandemic. Even in terms of the deal-making activity, like we see a lot of rise, while that was on hold during the initial months of the pandemic, but we see a lot of rise in deal activity now. As businesses are in need of funds, and investors are also looking to take advantage of the lower valuations currently. Secondary deal activity is still a little bit slow because those who are already holding investments may be wanting to wait and watch unless there is a dire need of liquidity. I think we've seen quite a shift in the role of tax functions in businesses. They're getting involved in a lot more strategic decision making now. Which is very good, which is sort of keeping tax professionals on their toes. Businesses have been looking at a lot of options for restructuring supply chains, restructuring workforce, funding options, all of those things, maybe deals for non-core assets and those kind of things. And tax savings has actually been a significant source of cash inflow for businesses during this tough period when they've been battling with a cash crunch due to the lockdowns. From the government side also, there have been several stimulus packages that have been announced. On the tax side, on the tax policy side, they had come up with several immediate steps just at the start of the lockdown, which involved expedited refund issuances for certain categories of taxpayers, extension of timelines for various tax compliances, tax audit, tax payments, etc., reduced rates of withholding taxes, and interest for late deposit of taxes. Of course, the complete waiver of withholding taxes or interest for late deposit of taxes is something that the business community was expecting, but still the government did come out with these measures. Like Mahesh rightly said, there have of course been concerns for MNEs in terms of their employees who might be stranded due to the lockdown and may not have been able to travel back to their workplaces. It raises concerns while the government raises concerns on the residency of the individuals, and it raises concerns on permanent establishment and residency for the foreign companies that they work for. The government did come out with some clarifications on the residential status for these individuals themselves, but there hasn't been anything much that we've heard on the PE front or on the residency rules for companies, because their decision makers may be stuck in India. I think another interesting thing that's happening is, of course, businesses are are sort of incurring a lot of expenditure currently in facilitating work from home for their employees. So they've been incurring spends on providing infrastructure to the employees to set up home offices in that sense. And they have been lobbying with the government to sort of provide clarifications in terms of the tax effects of those kind of spending, that it should be allowed as a complete deduction for those businesses, shouldn't be taxed in the hands of the employees as perquisites. So that's been happening. I think the shift in the global supply chain, the sort of disruption in the global supply chain that the pandemic caused initially, has also led the Indian government to come up with a significant campaign for making India self-reliant, and I'll be talking more about it in some of the other sections of this discussion. But that's also an interesting space to watch out for. In terms of what the initiatives that the government is trying to boost domestic manufacturing, to boost Indian businesses and make them globally competitive in the supply chain.
Thank you, Anupa. And it will be interesting to see what stance India will take when it comes to international tax going forward in order to boost its finances. But with that, we'll pass on to Dan, who's located in DC, so in the midst of all the action that is currently going on in the US. He's joining, or he's part of the House Ways and Means Committee, and we are very pleased to have him here on the panel just after the US elections. And I'm curious to hear whether he shares the optimism and what your views are then.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you for having me. As with the rest of the world, COVID-19 has had a really severe impact here, with over 11.5 million confirmed cases and over 250,000 deaths. After some improvement over the summer in the United States, we've seen new cases growing, and right now at quite a fast rate. So I can't right now share Mahesh's optimism on the short term. I think we're going to continue to see some growth, and that's probably going to lead to further restrictions in movement and in business activity. We have had some restrictions that had been put in place over the summer removed. And now we're seeing our state and local governments put some of those restrictions both in movement and in business openings back in place. And that's again going to continue to have push the economy in a contracting direction, and of course just has an effect on individual morale and business morale. In the United States, restrictions on movement and business openings are generally implemented in the state and local level, and so we've seen different approaches in different states and localities, and that also impacts both the United States' ability to have a coherent national policy, and also on the effectiveness of some of those proposals, in particular in places where there's generally a lot of movement, or in border areas or situations like that. Turning to the fiscal response, I think in response to the first wave, the fiscal response that the United States had was actually one of the brighter spots here. Congress passed 3 bills, which together spent about $2.3 trillion US, and that fiscal stimulus probably cut the drop in GDP in half, from about 8% to closer to 4% in the looking at the first 3 quarters of this year. So that's a really significant, I think, positive development. What that legislation did was it had a lot of spending. So in addition to spending on health, like testing and vaccine development and healthcare supplies to deal with people who were suffering from COVID-19. There are also direct payments to individuals, grant and loan facilities, and tax credits for domestic businesses, increases in unemployment assistance. So again, a lot of just spending to try to boost the economy, and also some changes to business tax rules. The IRS implemented some changes to business tax rules, which will make it so that if a person is located in the United States as a result of COVID-19 not being able to get back to home country, there is some relief related to presence in the US, but most of the congressional changes weren't really focused on the international area as such. They were focused on domestic businesses. So allowing more generous use of losses. We'll have a 5-year carryback of losses, and that will probably produce significant tax refunds in 2021 for the losses suffering this year, and that will in the future give a tax boost to businesses. And also, of course, businesses will adjust their tax payments this year in response to these rules. There's also been a relaxation on limits on interest deductibility, which was another because the interest deductibility limit that was put in place in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the 2017 tax legislation in the US, looks to percentage of income. The drop in income, if that didn't correspond to a drop in interest expense, companies would find themselves hit by the interest limitation. That of course comes out of, or is related to, one of the BEPS project recommendations on use of interest. And so I think this experience can be a little bit of a lesson to tax policymakers in thinking about tax legislation, because we have to think not only about how legislation will perform during boom times or during normal times, but also how it'll perform in recessions and times of crisis. And so I think that some of the legislative changes made in the United States were sort of looking at our tax code that changed so much in 2017 and thinking, how do we need to change the tax code to, at least on a temporary basis, to deal better with this, with the recession situation. So sort of looking forward, I think with the second wave, there's a lot of interest in further legislation, but so far that's been stuck in partisan gridlock. Sometimes following an election in the United States, there's people are able to put those partisan issues to the side, and there's kind of an end of year legislative push, especially on bipartisan priorities, but that really hasn't come together yet from my perspective. I think there's wide agreement that we should do something, but there's not consensus about the size of what we should do, and so that's left us doing nothing at this time. And looking ahead to next year, I think, and thinking about what the president-elect has proposed in his campaign, the issue of supply chain also came up in the United States because thinking about the medical devices and medical supplies and how and even face masks being part of a global supply chain, really put a focus on the need to have domestic or at least regional capacity to satisfy those needs. And so people are looking at both trade and tax incentives and thinking, how can we make sure that we have supply chain security in the United States? And so that's, I think, another way that we might see tax play into the response to to COVID-19 next year and into the future. But of course, setting up supply chain and resiliency is really a long-term thing, and it's difficult I think that's really a different thing from thinking of what's the short-term response to this crisis.
And I think in the US, you're at least from an outside point of view, you're really in an interesting spot right now. You're kind of in this interim situation, and then at the same time, we remember well the past years where the budget discussions were always a very interesting debate discussed globally, I presume. And then at the same time, as a Swiss, I know very well what it is like to have state level measures combined with federal level measures, and these discussions and the frictions that may arise from that. So actually, from an outsider point of view, quite an interesting spot to be in. But yeah, even though there is not only positive aspects to it, of course, we are all aware of that.
I think that's right, and it's interesting that you bring up the budget discussions because even basic questions like how will Congress be able to pass a law that continues existing spending on relatively normal programs can be a question when there's a lack of trust. And of course, thinking into next year, how the new Congress and the new administration will be able to agree to a budget in these unusual times, I think raised a lot of uncertainty. And from the business perspective's point of view, I think it'll be very important to think how do you take that uncertainty into account, because the government isn't providing a lot of comfort on what the fiscal or both the taxing and the spending climate's going to be.
Yeah. Any other spontaneous views from the panel on the current status?
Well, Claudia, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Hello, everyone. Well, I speak from Italy, and well, I would like to share a pessimistic view just to side with, Michael perspective. Well, what I think is that the Italian situation, what I see in the Italian situation is that actually we have been, the government has only enacted what I call stopgap measure. and mainly including tax deferral, for instance, deferral for VAT returns, and also for paying taxes, and also cash and bonus handouts. But what I fail to see is actually a strategy in the field, a long-term strategy also for reforming the tax system to fit actually to the new reality of the COVID-19. So that's my perspective.
Thank you, Giorgio, for balancing out the views here.
Thank
then
you.
let's maybe pass on to Caroline to an Austrian view, not so much on what the current situation is, but rather on what your personal situation is. Namely, you're also a prize winner, and congratulations from my side to your Maurice Laurey Prize, which you won this year. This is truly amazing. So your thesis analyzes the role of permanent establishments in VAT law. Why did you choose that topic?
Oh yes, thank you, Claudia. I would also like to talk on the previous topic, but this topic is of course also at the heart of my interest. So I'm really glad to be here, and I feel really honored to have received this award. I still can remember when I visited the IFA Congress when I was a doctoral student, and also always saw the people standing on the stage winning this prestigious prize, and now it's me, so I can't really believe that, so I feel really honored. And the topic of my thesis, I have the book here with me, it's permanent establishment value-added tax, as you already said, and I choose that topic because in my research career I always wanted to, I love those topics which had a link to direct tax law and to VAT law, and this topic seemed perfectly matched to this kind of interest. So because I think you can always learn from one field in direct tax law and try to transpose experience to the other field. So this is why I choose this topic, and I also realized that this is a very practically highly relevant topic in practice, which is proven by the ECJ case law. Unfortunately, I couldn't take into account the newest cases, which proved, but nevertheless, the newest cases like the Dongyang case, for example, they proved this topic to be of very high relevance. So I'm really glad that I chose that topic.
So then can you elaborate on the practical relevance of the topic? So what do readers really expect from reading your book? Is there a practical angle?
Of course, there is a practical angle. There's an academic angle, of course, as well, and also some tax policy angle. But the practical angle and the tax policy angle and all of that focus on three issues. This is first the definition of a permanent establishment or fixed establishment, as we call it in EU VAT law. Then there is second, the question, how does an establishment play a role in allocation of taxing rights? And this is in VAT, especially for B2B supplies of services, where the establishment of the customer serves as a proxy for the destination principle and for the business use. So it helps in allocating the taxing right on the supply of services. And third, the third area where I focused on is the VAT treatment of intra-company supplies, so head office branch transactions or branch transactions. And all of these areas are analyzed with respect to historical backgrounds in the EU VAT law area, but also with respect to tax policy principles like the neutrality principle and with respect to the OECD VAT GST guidelines. So you can find an analysis of all the cases, but also in the light of tax policy principles. So it's both for academics and also for practitioners. It could be helpful to read the book.
Very good. So is your conclusion that the notion of permanent establishment has to be aligned between income taxation and VAT?
This is a topic which is quite disputed. In my opinion, they should not be aligned, at least not in full. Of course, it would have it would be helpful for practitioners and ease compliance if you would align both definitions in full. But I think this is not really possible because both taxes serve different purposes. So in income tax, the permanent establishment serves as a substance threshold to allocate profits and to give taxing rights to the source state, to the market state. You can analyze that retrospectively, for example, for the time threshold to establish a permanent establishment. In VAT, the fixed establishment serves as a proxy for business use to allocate taxing rights to the state of destination, especially for B2B supplies of services. But it's analyzed on a transaction basis, so you cannot do that retrospectively, which there is a need for different kind of criteria probably because of that. And in addition, you also have different people and persons who levy and collect the tax. In VAT, it's the supplier usually who has to analyze if he has to issue an invoice with VAT or without VAT, and he has to analyze if his customer has an establishment, but he has not the knowledge and the information about the customer, so there's a lack of information. In direct tax law, the person paying the tax and the person who has the information is the same. So in VAT, you need more simplification rules, which speaks in favor that there cannot be a full alignment of both definitions.
That is a very interesting point, and you also make another very interesting point, and especially you come to, at least from a business perspective, very interesting conclusion when you make a systematic comparison of the approach to intercompany transactions and the recharge method as proposed by on the one hand the EU VAT law and on the other hand by the OECD VAT law.
Yes. There is the VAT treatment of intercompany transactions across the border between head office and branch, or branch, also permanent establishment or fixed establishment, is disputed, and there are different ways how to treat it. And in the EU, based on the famous FCE Bank case, intercompany transactions across the border, especially services, are not taxable. They're out of scope. We do not tax that within the EU. The OECD and the OECD VAT guidelines propose a different approach, which is called the recharge method. And they propose that this should be taxable with respect to externally acquired services. This means in the first step, the external supplier can allocate the supply to the establishment of the customer which he is contracting with. He does not need to analyze who is actually using the service. And in the second step, under the recharge method, the business customer, which has establishments in many jurisdictions, has to make a recharge to the establishment of use, and this recharge should be subject to VAT. This should allow to implement the destination principle in a more accurate way, and it should avoid tax planning structures where you channel services through branches and jurisdictions with a low VAT rate. So the OECD is proposing that in the guidelines. The EU VAT system does not follow that at the moment. In my opinion, it's difficult to say which of both approaches you should favor, because the recharge method would bring a lot of complexity. So in my opinion, we should really be cautious before implementing this method in the EU, but we will see if this will be the way forward. It's a decision to be made by the policymakers in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is extremely interesting and highly relevant because this impacts businesses very much coming in the coming years, and therefore this is certainly a topic to watch out for and to be mindful of. So thank you, and it's great also to see that there is a business-friendly approach altogether being proposed in your work.
Yeah, thank you.
So maybe, Michael, I hand over to you.
Thanks. Yes, and then by the way, also there's a chance to win a copy of this thesis as well, right? And the link is also again on the slide deck and also in the app. So if you want to read more on this, in English, you can participate in that sweepstakes. Indeed, we move on because we wanted to also continue a discussion that we started last year at the London Congress. For those of you who were there, we had a whole YIN seminar devoted to digital transformation. And the question that came up already at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis is whether that crisis itself and its impact is accelerating digital transformation in our profession or in digital or in international tax more generally. So that is basically the question we want to put forward to our panel. Some of you have already pointed to it, but before moving to that, let's also see what our audience here thinks about this before we start the discussion, because we have a polling question that our dear friends in Rotterdam are going to put on the screen. There it is, very simple question for you to agree or disagree with this statement. So giving you a few moments to read, to contemplate, and to click agree or disagree. And whether you think that the COVID crisis accelerates digital transformation in international tax. And this probably was enough time for you to think about it. So curious to see the results.
Not yet digested, maybe? Too many replies.
There we go. And there we are. Wow, this is, I think, a telltale figure. 90% of you agree with that statement. So the question is our worldwide panel thinking the same? So I was thinking maybe Lucas, because you are really in a transformative business, I'd say, working for eBanks. So if I may I ask you to first share your perspective on basically on this statement from perspective maybe from you in eBanks, but also more generally as an international tax professional. Lucas.
Sure, Michael, thank you. I would say that we've certainly seen an increase in the revenues and operations of digital businesses, of e-commerce, and of new structures of digital businesses that perhaps did exist before the pandemic, but were improved or modified after the pandemic. We've seen this in Brazil, and I deal with Brazil and other jurisdictions as well, especially in Latin America. We've seen this across the continent, really, and this is something that certainly has been increased or sped up by the pandemic after March, at least February or March of this year. But that's an interesting point, because this is what I can see from the perspective of businesses. But going to the question whether that means that international tax and will be subject to digital transformation. And I would imagine that by that, one perspective could be whether tax authorities are going to use digital tools or artificial intelligence or machine learning or blockchain or other technologies to facilitate their activities or to actually improve their control of the activities of taxpayers. I think that is a necessity. It's not something that is only happened after the pandemic. It predates the pandemic, really. It is a necessity because businesses are becoming more agile and more complex because they use servers in different countries, and they do things that up until 5 years ago no one thought was possible, and now tax authorities are required to keep up and to understand what that means. My sector, which is payment processing, we have several regulatory classifications that payment processing platforms can be subject to, and tax authorities sometimes have difficulty in understanding whether we're subject to one of those or another, and the tax implications can vary wildly between those regulatory classifications. So if tax authorities don't adhere to some sort of artificial intelligence or increased use of machine learning or other technologies, they will lag behind. They won't provide to society the response that society would need in terms of control and ability to collect revenues. So I think that at least after this massive event in history, which was the pandemic and what it caused for many countries, I think that tax authorities will be pushed to do that in many ways. Also because of budget pressure, they're going to have to find out new ways to tax, especially the digital economy. We know of many countries that have taken the political support, let's say, of the claims by health agencies and the public health service to use that as some sort of leverage to push for digital services taxes across the world, not only in Europe, but also in Latin America and in Brazil. So I think that that's certainly a trend for the future. If tax authorities don't adopt some sort of new technology or modern technologies to assist them in their work, they will lag behind this wave of digital economy revolution that the pandemic forced us really to adopt and to move on to.
Thanks, Lucas. So I know that also Anuba put some thought into this, and India, of course, is even a bigger. It's also a BRICS country, but definitely bigger than Brazil as well. Also a home of some of the smartest IT wizards. Anuba, what is the perspective that you would like to share?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think actually what Lucas shared was a pretty interesting perspective on how tax administrations need to be looking at it going forward. What I thought I could talk about is how, yes, there has been certainly an increased digital transformation in the business world, both in businesses as well as in the professional services world. We see a lot of focus now on digitization of processes, digitization of data, documents, everything. We see a lot of focus on automated tools being developed to basically take care of manual tasks, which involve a lot of data mining and analysis, to free up more time for people to be actually engaged in more productive tasks, being engaged in more strategic decision making. That is certainly something that is picking up all across the board. Also, like even on the deal side, again, I think due diligences were like sort of hit and had to be completely put on hold because of the sudden imposition of lockdowns, and that also made businesses realize the need for actually having digitized processes and data. And now the deal activity is picking up again. I think investors and GPs are sort of now focusing a lot on virtual due diligences through either through cloud-based data storage rooms or through portable on-site cameras. Of course, data security and privacy remains like the most critical aspect in all of these virtual data rooms, and newer technologies, I think, are being developed all the time to address those concerns. Another interesting aspect that we are seeing here is also that businesses are realizing the efficiencies of working from home, like be it doing away with the limitations of geographical boundaries, giving everybody an equal seat at the table, generally savings in time, savings in cost, increased productivity of people. So a lot of businesses have actually also started planning, having more long-term strategic plans for moving to a partial or a full work from home for either specific sections within their organization or across the organization. And they're actually looking to give up real estate and give up their office space for the long term, even post being out of this COVID-19 pandemic situation. The other thing I think that's happening, which is interesting in India, is that data localization laws have been in the works since quite some time. This is so for all multinational enterprises for whom now, and all of these in the digital business space, for whom data is really the key value driver. And for those who have a large user base in India, it's going to have a significant impact. I think plans are underway for building a robust data infrastructure in India. The industry has been again discussing with the government on what support the government can also provide in terms of either investment support or tax incentives for setting up all of the data development, data-related infrastructure. On the tax administration side, I think ever since the lockdown, there have been virtual hearings with the tax authorities, with the courts in India, and all of that has sort of now settled in and is working smoothly. India was anyway in the process of reforming its tax administrative processes, and it has recently launched a faceless audit scheme for domestic taxpayers, which is sort of meant to standardize the whole process, make it centralized, and make it a simpler and more effective process for taxpayers. So again, in that process, physical hearings are anticipated to be either very low or not at all, and therefore there'll be a much greater reliance on technology for conducting tax audits going forward. So those are all the things that I thought were some interesting things happening in India on the digitization front.
I also wanted to briefly go to Africa again, because maybe one of the continents where digitalization may have the biggest impact is actually Africa. I know that also from previous engagement in those countries in various roles, that the digital transformation is really bringing businesses closer together, where there perhaps in the past wasn't a proper infrastructure. Everybody is adopting mobile banking, mobile internet, and surely that must also have an impact on the way tax administration deal with their taxpayers. So Elisangela, if I may ask you, so what are you seeing from your regional perspective?
Thank you, Michael. Well, I'm not sure I can speak for the continent. The different countries we've been observing that in Africa have been implementing faster or different measures to adapt to digitalization. I would say in Angola, the business sector has been, as is expected, ahead of the government and the policy making. And so I would say that the digitalization, and I agree, if I could answer to the question that was presented, definitely agree that this pandemic has promoted digitalization. But I would say that more on the government side, because in some way businesses were going digital, have been operating digital within the infrastructure that they had available, whether it's through phone banking or just the simple technological means that they were operating digitally, even small and informal business operators. So what we are noticing is a correspondent reaction to the government and to the policy making institutions. The central bank finally coming up with digital payment services or digital payment avenues to accommodate those needs that the business sector has been trying to push forward, and have actually been operating without them and up to now. So we're seeing a responsiveness from the policy making side, and that is where I would say that the pandemic has improved and boosted the system. I definitely agree with what's been said, that even though the tax administration is usually reactive, and I believe that is the natural flow of our sector, we come as a reaction to what the market operators create and the needs that come and the problems that need to be solved. So even though we are reactive, I do believe that as tax administrations, we definitely should pick up pace, because there is no way back, there is no slowing down, and we're finally seeing that, I would say.
Thanks, Elisangela. I think there were a few other panel members who also wanted to give a brief response. So maybe to have a totally different perspective first. I know that Caroline wanted to briefly add a perspective.
Yes, thank you, Michael. Yeah, I just wanted to add 3 points, maybe from an Austrian perspective or from European perspective. First, I think in VAT we see definitely a digitalization pushed. For example, in VAT law, many member states introduced e-reporting or different kinds of digitalization measures to collect VAT more efficiently. And now the Commission, which started already previously to the pandemic, is now even more pushed in the direction to make some harmonization of all these digitalization tools, to have similar tools in all European member states. So I think this will be pushed by the pandemic to have some harmonization on digital, of the use of technology in VAT at the tax administration level, which would be good. Second, I would like to mention in Austria, the government tries to link this kind of tax incentives, which we have now, or in general incentives, to digitalization. For example, we have a special investment bonus. If you invest now, then you get 7% investment bonus. But if you invest in goods which are linked to digitalization, you get the double bonus. You get 14%. So the government tries to link the investment, the measures to digitalization now, which makes sense to push investments into the digitalization. And third, as I'm also a tax academic, at university we can see a massive push to digitalization. So distance teaching, distance learning, this was alien to the Austrian university system before. Austrian university was meant to be a physical on-site event. Nowadays, we had to move from one day to the other to distance teaching. And we even do online exams, which was really a challenge, but it went quite well. Based on the circumstances, was quite well. And this was a major change, which would never have happened without the pandemic.
Right. Although I guess nothing really beats real sort of in-person interaction, right? Yeah, exactly. I also know that Mahesh wanted to come in with a few comments.
Just a different angle on this digital transformation. And of course, I think one thing that we all agree is that in this whole lockdown world, the biggest winner clearly is big tech, right? And I think a country like Singapore is a huge beneficiary of this whole wave of digital transformation. And so Singapore is already is the regional headquarters for probably 60% of the world's largest tech MNCs, right? And in fact, during the lockdowns, and you may be aware of all this, the US-China rift and what some of these tech companies have gone through. And we've seen companies like TikTok, Tencent, and Zoom, announce that they're going to be establishing huge data centers in Singapore. And they're looking at Singapore as some sort of a neutral base between US and China. And we expect a large number of employees, senior managers from all these companies to shift to Singapore and run this base or these headquarters. And very recently, the government also announced a special type of long-term permit, or some sort of a visa for tech entrepreneurs or senior professionals in the tech industry to shift to Singapore. So it's this is another way in which Singapore is trying to take advantage of what's happening with digital, with tech companies, and to bring them all to Singapore. And I think it's pretty creative.
Well, that's very interesting. For sure, the digital transformation will bring in new jobs. And of course, some other jobs will disappear as well. Let's not forget about those. So I think it's time to move on to a small intermezzo where we wanted to highlight some of the poster program participants who send in a video explaining a bit about their research. Maybe some of them are the future prize winners of the thesis awards that we saw. So we go that before we turn to the panel.
Hi, my name is Gabriela, and I'm a researcher and teaching associate at WU in Vienna. My PhD focus is simplification measures in transfer pricing, a very current topic as complexity in the application of the arm's length principle increases, also in light of the digitalization of the economy. The OECD has also recognized the need for simplification, and the use of fixed margins is now being discussed in Amount B of the unified approach. My research analyzes which simplification measures can be used to simplify each step of the transfer pricing analysis, and whether such measures are compatible with the arm's length principle and the tax treaties. I invite you to have a look at my poster and send any comments via email or LinkedIn. Thank you.
Hello, dear IFA friends. My name is Savas Kostikidis. I'm from Greece, and I work as a research associate at the Max Planck Institute for Tax Law and Public Finance in Munich. My research at the Max Planck Institute focuses on matters of international and European tax law. My research topic is titled Residence and Economic Substance of Subsidiary Corporations. The ultimate question that I deal with relates to whether there's a systematic relationship between substance requirements for subsidiary corporation in European and international tax law. Are these substance requirements the same or are they different? And if they are different, is there a justification for that? I would like to hear your thoughts and opinions about these matters. Thank you very much.
Hi, Young IFA Network. My name is Ioana Felicia Roșca and I come from Bucharest, Romania. I'm a doctoral student with Wirtschaft Universität, and I have 1 minute to introduce you to my research topic, which is on the provisions of anti-tax avoidance that tackle the use of hybrid financial instruments in the European Union. I am fascinated about situations that are very legalistic and they have substance and there is no concern on the economic reality of the parties. However, they end up in double non-taxation due to the disparities of different member states' tax jurisdictions. So I very much look forward to meeting you virtually and have a fruitful discussion during the poster program of the International Fiscal Association Congress of 2020 online. Stay safe.
So was great to see what the poster programmers did in order to deliver their message in a digital way rather than in a personal way. This year, now that we have a virtual congress rather than a physical congress. Now, we would like to move on, or actually move back to a question we've already looked at right at the beginning of our panel, namely, who will bear the burden of that crisis we're currently in? We've heard in the introductory round that there are several stimulus packages that have been taken, that governments are trying to make sure that economies keep on running and that businesses don't fail or crash. But we would like also to hear your view after what you've heard. Maybe you have changed your views after the discussion that we've had so far. So we would like to raise another polling question to the audience and hear from the audience what you think on who bears the burden today. Maybe Studio Eva, can you bring up the polling question? So the question is, my government plans to put the burden of increased spending on, and then what do you think? Is it the multinationals, again, that will have to bear the burden? Is it the high net worth individuals who post pictures from them being on yachts and in safe places in the world not being affected by COVID? Is it the workers that we've heard an increase of consumption tax? So is it the general population that will bear the burden? Polluting industries in order to also add another layer of morality, maybe even? Or is it just random, anything else? And it will be quite interesting to see what you think as an outcome, especially after what we've heard, because we've heard so many different and interesting views on measures and policies in the different regions in the world. So do we already have the answers ready, what the audience think? Oh, that's quite an interesting result. So high net worth individuals slightly ahead of multinationals, but it's actually quite balanced as a result. General population, even polluting industries will get affected more. It's an interesting result. So with that, it would be interesting also now to go again to Dan, because you've talked about the stimulus packages that were taken by your politicians and what you are looking at implementing in order to curb spending. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So as I mentioned before, the United States had a robust federal response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that response has been deficit financed. So there were not new taxes put in place to finance that $2.3 trillion in new spending. And of course, in addition to the deficit generated directly from those spending bills, there will also be a decline in income tax revenue just from the overall decline in the economy. And the United States is very reliant on an income tax, and the income tax revenues very significantly, especially on the business side with profitability. And so for those reasons, I expect that there will continue to be a decline in US tax receipts. And looking on the other hand, there are some countervailing fiscal factors. One thing we were just talking about in the last panel was the expansion in the digital economy. And of course, many digital businesses are headquartered in the United States, and so their profits are taxed in the United States. And you might think, well, could the United States tax those multinationals and use that to pay for some of those, the spending that we've seen, or the decline in the physical economy? I think that at least under current law, it's highly unlikely that there will be anything near a sufficient countervailing effect from the profits from those businesses to offset the overall decline and the increased spending. And in general, I think it makes sense for the government to spend more in a recession or during a crisis. This is really the reason that these kind of situations are the reason that you have deficit spending. And so I don't think that is unreasonable in the short term. I think the other relevant factor that has led the U.S. to deficit spending so far is the persistent low interest rates in the United States. The fact that the federal government can borrow at very favorable rates has really, in the medium term, allowed to put off some of those difficult questions about how you might pay for something. The other kind of contrast between the U.S. federal government is that our state governments generally don't have the same flexibility in deficit financing. And so to the extent that this question of who bears the burden, either in the form of spending cuts or the form of increased taxation, I think will be confronted first at the state and local level. And there's a division, and as in many federal systems, there's a division in the United States between the responsibilities of the federal government and the responsibilities that are taken at the state and local level. And so it's possible that in things like local infrastructure and education and some of the things that directly affect resident individuals, you might see spending cuts, even though from a policy perspective, cutting those kind of things during a downturn is probably the worst policy outcome. So that's kind of an unfortunate feature of this allocation of capacity and allocation of responsibilities between the federal government and the state governments. I think in the long run, there will be pressure to find new sources of revenue eventually, although I don't know exactly what form that'll take. And of course, all of the candidates that we put up in the recent polling questions are candidates that could potentially be in the political discourse. In the President-elect Biden's campaign, he supported raising taxes on high income individuals and on corporations, both from their domestic income and from their foreign source income. And in part, that was to pay for new spending ideas. So that is one conceivable direction. I think tax increases, you can always raise the rate, but I think also base broadeners are definitely in the mix. And of course, there are some folks who'd like to see environmental taxes. Those haven't gotten broad political traction in the United States yet, but I think there's interest, and especially if that moves in the rest of the world, again, in the long run, it has to remain part of the conversation. And then getting to like your core question of what we as younger people might be thinking about, which is, is this debt going to come due in a generation hence? So are we going to be footing the bill for that? And I think that's a fair question. I certainly don't have any greater insight into the answer, but in the long run, I think at least from the U.S. perspective, we're either going to see higher taxes, or eventually the persistent deficit financing will probably result in depreciating U.S. dollar. Symbolically, the U.S. right now just passed an accumulated national debt in excess of GDP for the first time since World War II, and so I think again debt issues will be on the radar, but we're not really seeing the consequences of that immediately. When we do have to confront those consequences that have heretofore been hidden, I think that that could be a big adjustment for the United States in the sort of short term, where we've had both low interest rates and the ability to deficit spend. It really kind of obscures some of those hard decisions. So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. And honestly,
yes.
Your guess is as good as mine.
Yes, and actually your view contrasts quite a bit from the view we're going to hear next, namely Mahesh is from Singapore, because you have various levels of complexity looking at the state level, local level, federal level, which situation Singapore does not have to confront. And also the other interesting thing is that you were discussing largely about low interest rates and how you wish to further deflate, or how that will lead to further deflation of your currency. But Singapore is in a different position. You're surrounded by actually countries where you see comparatively high interest rates. And looking forward to hearing your views.
Sure. So the question on who really should bear the burden, right? In this COVID world and with all these deficits. And even here, there is this general fear that governments and tax authorities around the world are generally going to be more aggressive going forward. Of course, they're always known to be aggressive, but now it's going to go to a different level. And yes, it's quite expected that they will collect their so-called pound of flesh from MNCs, investors, and wealthy people. Now, I think this kind of a trend will be quite counterproductive, because for a real recovery, right, after COVID, we have to see a real boom in cross-border trade and investment. Now, merely increasing corporate or even personal income tax burden, now, that kind of approach will only distort things. See, the fact is, companies, in a sense, countries will be quite competitive, right? Will continue to be competitive, and they will continue to compete for investment and cash flow. So, if any country that is going to, let's say, tax or come up with some sort of an arbitrary or unilateral standard to tax MNCs or wealthy people, they're just going to risk having these MNCs or these investors just shift to another more attractive country. Very recently, Singapore signed up to this free trade agreement known as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and this covers 15 countries in the APAC region, right, including Japan, Australia, and China, of course. And because unfortunately, India and the US are not part of it. But this is probably one of the largest FTAs in the history of FTAs, right? And covers almost 1/3 of the entire world's population. Now, when you look at a development like this, there are probably two ways to consider it. One, of course, it's a great attempt to reverse this whole trend of protectionism that you're seeing around the world, right? But again, when you look at an FTA or a free trade agreement, it essentially tries to eliminate tariffs on trade and between all the countries who are party to this. Now, then the question is, in this world of deficits, or if a country has a serious budget deficit, is there an incentive to sign up to an FTA? And the answer is yes. It's yes, because it will stimulate trade and investment, and ultimately it will generate more tax revenues, right? So if you look at Singapore, of course, some people think it's a low tax country or something like that, but actually, corporate and personal income tax does contribute to almost 38% of its total revenues, right? And with customs and GST just being around 19%. Now, I don't expect a country like Singapore to increase corporate taxes. Of course, there is going to be a scheduled increase in the GST after 2021, but this was all proposed much before COVID. Right, so now a country like Singapore, I think, will continue to try to be as competitive as possible. To continue to try to move MNCs to set up regional headquarters, have funds shift base to Singapore. I mean, the assets under management in Singapore are already across $2.5 trillion, right? And the government is very conscious of preserving Singapore's reputation and also ensuring that Singapore should remain competitive, while also ensure that the tax incentives are only provided to players who make serious commitments or serious economic commitments, right? So I think countries around the world should be very careful with how they use tax policy as part of their whole post-COVID strategy, right? Because on the face of it, it seems as if raising corporate tax rates or taxing MNCs may work, but I think this will only be a disaster. It'll just shift economic activity to more competitive jurisdictions, and that has never changed, right? Of course, there is this whole change in terms of substance-driven tax planning and things like that, but tax planning will always be a driver. And so in my view, the whole focus has to be on stimulating trade and investment, and that will automatically increase tax revenues. And tax should not be the primary means of taking care of these deficits.
Thank you, Mahesh. Very interesting. Now we jump again back to the continent, and now back to Lucas, who would also like to share his view on who bears the burden.
Thank you, Claudia. It's just a quick comment, really. It's about, I think that one of the categories of the poll was multinationals. And I think that many assume that, well, multinationals, many of which are in the digital space, will be subject to taxes like a digital services tax, which are taxes that are now appearing everywhere. Every country is creating their own version of a digital services tax. But I would also like to point out that one of the type of company that will bear the burden definitely, and is not a huge multinational, are companies that are multinationals but are small because they're startups and they're just using the digital space to sell products and sell services. And we've been seeing this in recent months, really, with the discussions about digital services taxes. Those companies, they can't really bear a lot of compliance costs because they are very small. They don't have the infrastructure to calculate and pay all those taxes in different countries. But they are starting to realize that every country wants to enact and to implement their own digital services tax. And as was said in the Zoom webinar chat by one of the attendees, many of these digital services taxes are being implemented with very broad language. They're very broad in application. And this is an issue for many companies that don't really know whether they are subject to that or not. And sort of to be conservative, they just decide to pay it. but they don't have the infrastructure to pay all those taxes in all those countries and to make sure that they're complying with the law. So it's an indirect cost, really. It's not really a tax cost that I'm talking about, because they would have to pay taxes like multinationals, big multinationals would have to, but they incur a compliance burden that is quite high in light of the scale of their operations in the digital space. They sort of entered the digital world, the digital economy, thinking, well, we can be lean because we don't have to have the sort of a huge headquarters and many employees. We just need an app and we're on our way. But they are faced with the reality of budget pressure and a fiscal crisis everywhere, and countries really using that tool to make sure that they have enough revenues to support welfare programs and public health services and so on. So I think that I would highlight that not only big multinationals, but also the smaller companies that operate in the digital space, they're going to bear a burden related to this period of the pandemic, certainly.
I very much welcome your comment on that, and actually maybe an additional question to you, somewhat related to that, because you made your comment more generally, but I also believe, I would also be interested in hearing from you, how do you as a company feel about all these subsidies being granted to industries that are maybe even old industries, not keeping up with the developments? Maybe they should be going or should have gone for a long time, but now they're kept alive with subsidies, and you moving around in a modern environment, being agile and digital. And how do you feel as a company or as a digital international company about all these subsidies or tax money being spent on old industries, while you will have going forward to pay for that?
Yeah, that's certainly a problem. And I would say that actually that occurred to me after the first panel discussion, which was about what's going on after COVID-19 and during COVID-19, really. And I was thinking that although we are seeing tax incentives, sort of temporary tax incentives for just a few tweaks and to allow companies to pay those taxes in a deferred sort of months afterwards, we are also seeing many of the tax incentives from the past being revoked by state authorities in Brazil, certainly, and by municipal authorities in major cities, because exactly of what you said, because those tax incentives have been granted to even inefficient industries just to keep them alive because of the tax incentives. And those tax incentives are being paid for by tax dollars, tax money that is coming from really a lot of like individuals, companies in the digital space. So I definitely take your point that yes, we've been seeing those tax incentives being rolled back progressively as the crisis continues, and we expect them to continue to be diminished or revoked or eliminated in 2021. And I think that that's a positive development. I would much rather have a sensible, rational, easy to understand tax system in many countries and in Brazil certainly, than having sort of this patchwork of taxes, tax rules that are not efficient, coupled with tax incentives for companies that only survive because those tax incentives are in place. And that's not a very sane way of running international or domestic tax policy, really.
I couldn't agree more on that. So thank you very much for the comment. And now we leave that topic again to go to our last prize winners. It's Giorgio. Giorgio won the IFA President Yin Scientific Award for his paper about citizenship and tax. Congratulations also to you on that. This year we saw a really high level of applications and papers, so that one was among the really outstanding ones. And I'll discuss your other papers at the very end very briefly, but this one was also very outstanding in terms of topic and how you elaborated on that. So how did you get to write about citizenship and tax, and what role does it play at all today?
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Of course, I was really honored because also I knew the level of the other papers that were presented. And well, what is the actual role of citizenship today in the tax world of today? Well, most tax fellows do believe that in today's tax world, residence rather than citizenship plays a role by setting for, let's say, a meaningful connection, or if you want, the qualifying tax nexus between an individual and a country. And also I know that there is widespread belief that the use of citizenship as a criterion for tax jurisdiction is confined actually to the practice of a few outlier countries. Let's say one example for all, the United States, which is a country that, as we all know, taxes not only their fellow citizenship residing in the US territory, but also those permanently living overseas. For instance, we know they are called the accidental Americans. So in my view, however, this understanding is part, and this is also the reason I tried to write the paper, is that this understanding is actually partly misplaced. This is not only because, as I said, the United States and also other less known countries, for example, Eritrea, which imposes a 2% levy on expatriates, have in fact embraced a domestic system of citizenship-based taxation, but also because citizenship as a criterion might well increase the appeal of a preferential tax regime for new residents, or even be used for tax planning strategy. So that's, in a core, is the reason.
So can you give us some example of how citizenship can be used or can have a role in tax planning?
Sure, Claudia. Well, one thing to consider is, of course, there are many things that I consider in the paper, but just to go straight to the point, one thing to consider is that citizenship, or if you want, nationality, is listed, as we know, among the criterion included as a tiebreaker rule in case of dual residence. Of course, in case of a double tax convention. And even if it's subordinated to other criteria, for instance, the location of an individual permanent home, is center of vital interest and the location of an habitual abode, nationality or citizenship is capable of acting as a tiebreaker and thus to determine which countries a dual residence individual should be considered a tax residence for income tax purposes. Also, so that's one reason. And the second reason is that you have to consider the benefit actually related to citizenship by investment program, which are, as you know, offered by several states and even in the European Union. So acquisition of citizenship by using these, let's say, they are called golden passport scheme, or as the some scholars call it, jus pecunia scheme, can in fact constitute the springboard actually for applicant to assess, let's say, a preferential tax regime for new residents. And this and the acquisition of citizenship is a criterion, actually is often a requirement for an immigrant actually to relocate and stay in a country. And that's the reason, of course, a third reason, which is that holding a passport of another country might also serve for an individual to escape reporting under the common reporting standard, because this individual may misrepresent his actual tax resident status to a financial institution that carry out the due diligence procedure.
Well, there you touched upon a very hot topic right now. Maybe you anticipated a very hot topic with your paper, namely the citizenship programs that are offered that have been offered, for instance, by Cyprus. We've heard that after the Al Jazeera documentation, the Cyprus investment scheme was stopped starting from November. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Claudia. Yes, true. Actually, the Commission has started an investigation against the they call it the Cyprus papers. So against Cyprus, and maybe also a similar action will be taken against Malta. And also the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that European values should not be for sale. And I think that for sure the action will be, put forward has already been put forward by the Commission, and for sure it will, continue in the long term. But actually, we need to see how, the distance between, statements that are, done at the high level, so at the level, for instance, of the Commission, and actually what is the action on the ground. So we will see, I don't know, but we will see how far actually the Commission will go on its clampdown, at least is announced clampdown, and whether all citizenship by investment program, at least in the EU, will in fact be repealed.
Yes, that will be indeed interesting to see. And maybe just quickly delving or touching upon another topic which you've raised in another paper you've published, and there maybe one can also see that you seem to somehow anticipate the hot topics, because you also wrote a paper on the social contract and taxation, and I would like to quote one sentence from that paper that you've mentioned, and that fits perfectly in with our discussion we've just finished before, because you're stating that millennials are presumably the first generation to earn less than their predecessors, and there you already pointed to the direction of the discussion. Yeah,
thank you for your question, Claudia. Actually, also, you have to, my fear also that I heard about, the position of other panelists about who bears the burden in the previous panel. Well, my feel is that, of course, one of the things to look at is which is the categories that actually will foot the bill. But in my opinion, we also have to look at the who actually pay for the burden in time. So the point goes straight to the fairness across the generation. So that's one point that I would like to raise. And also I fear, as the economists point out, that my generation, actually our generation, so the millennials, might be called the recessional, because in the span of 10 years, just 10 years, we have experienced 2 crises. So that's my fear. And of course, the feeling is that the burden of the current crisis will be actually spread across the year. And of course, we will probably the ones that will in the end foot the bill.
Thank you very much, Giorgio. And with that, I think we're already almost at the end of our panel. Michael, what do you think?
I agree, and I think we've had a great discussion so far. I mean, the world is clearly in flux. We've seen a lot of different perspectives. We saw some concerning messages. We also saw some optimistic messages. But since this is a global pandemic, and I guess we're all in it together, we also have a common future. So in this final segment, maybe we should just ask our future tax leaders or dear panelists to reflect on what's coming next, and maybe ask them to share their lessons for the future. So maybe we can do a very quick tour around the world again to wrap up, and maybe give 60 seconds to each of us, and to hear what will be the lesson for the future. Mahesh, if I may ask you first, we start there.
Sure, Michael. I agree. This whole COVID pandemic has changed the world for good, and I'm not really sure whether this is now the new normal or the new abnormal. But and of course, it has been a hard time for everyone. But I'm always the optimist. I always think that every disaster is an opportunity in disguise. Right. So even during the lockdowns, you see, clients taking the time to restructure businesses, streamline operations, buy distressed assets. There's always an opportunity somewhere, right? There are some clients who have developed new products, new business models. Just like we'll have a whole generation of COVID babies, right? I guess we're going to have a generation of COVID tech unicorns, perhaps, right? And all this is great for us tax advisors, because if our clients are motivated and busy, then we continue to be busy, right? But I think in terms of policy, I think the first priority is not to be nasty when it comes to taxes, or at least for countries to be a little more reasonable, because your focus has to be on stimulating economic activity, trade, investment. And it's great to see so many countries represented on this panel, and of course, I guess throughout the Congress. And I hope going forward, rather than seeing new waves of COVID, we'll see new waves of probably a new wave of multilateralism, right, and more cooperation between all of us. So yeah,
Thank you.
End on a positive note, I guess.
Thank you, Mahesh, for your positive note. Anuba, what's your view?
I think, I mostly agree with Mahesh that there are some good things that have come out of this pandemic. I think it's generally across the world. I think in the whole business space as well, we've seen people being a lot more empathetic and a mutual support for each other. And I do hope to see that continue. I think, like I mentioned at the start of the discussion, specifically in India, we're looking forward to some of the initiatives that the government is focusing on keenly in terms of making India self-reliant. So they have this Make in India and Vocal for Local campaign. They're doing a lot of, there's a lot of initiatives being done in that space. Like there are incentives being rolled out for businesses. There's ease of setting up industries in India with the single window compliance system, all being through a digital platform. I think what it's also going to do is give a push to the startup culture, which has already been on the rise in India over the last few years. And particularly in the tech space, we do see a lot of innovation that is happening, and it will continue to, I think, happen going forward with the increased push towards digitization. We have our upcoming union budget in February in India, and I think the expectation for businesses is to sort of at least have some tax incentives for helping domestic businesses sustain and grow, as well as attracting investments, or for digital transformation of businesses, or for generally generating more employment opportunities. I think those are the areas where businesses are looking for certain support. Though, of course, I think everybody is cognizant of the fact that the government itself is dealing with a deficit that it needs to manage, and therefore any expectations on tax incentives need to be calibrated to that extent. On an overall, I think the government, like we've all already discussed in other parts of the panel, there will also be a focus on how the whole taxation of digital economy sort of shapes up throughout the world. What the OECD is doing, the UN's new proposal on automated digital services, the unilateral taxes in various countries. So that will be one thing that will keep tax professionals and tax functions of businesses on their toes, trying to figure out everything and how it all aligns with each other. I think on an overall note, what I would just like to end with is I think this is whatever the new normal, as everybody is calling it. And it's just time for us to be more responsible towards each other, be more disciplined, and I think just maintain a positive outlook with more, while being more agile and creative in this new and dynamic environment, I would say.
Thank you very much, Anuba. If we go to Professor Spiess in Vienna.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I would like to at the end mention one thing which I would like to stay, or which I would like to say is an opportunity, and one thing which maybe I hope will not stay, at least not in this extent. So the thing which I think will stay and which is good is the digitalization. And I think it's also a great opportunity for tax professionals. because I think there will be an increased need for people who are able to understand both kind of languages, the text language and the technology language. So people who are text technologists. So for the young generation, I would give the advice, if you have interest in this area, this would be a way forward and you will have a future if you can translate between text people and technology people. This is really a great area for young people. On the side, which I think we should not stay in this kind of extent, is this kind of online events. I like online events. It's a great online event today, but I would have loved to meet you all in person. So I really miss this kind of personal social contact. So I hope that we will get to this personal life, the social life in some way in the days in the future. I hope this will not take too long. So I hope to meet you all at a live on-site event in the future. So this is my wrap up for today. Thank you.
Cannot agree more with you, Caroline. I totally share that view. Probably everyone on the panel. Now handing over to Elisangela, who is representing a bit more the African continent still, although you mentioned at the outset that you cannot speak for the continent in its entirety.
Yes, thank you, Claudia. Well, I think my final remarks would be that we saw the pandemic brought challenged everybody in all different sectors. And even though there are proven difficulties for business operators to maximize their profits, whether it be because of limited access to infrastructure, a lack of maybe some services that would provide for easier digital operation, but yet businesses still managed to operate and to run. There was a big fear of bigger and total economic crash we had with the lockdown. And I think we can see, looking back now, it was not as bad as it was expected. Obviously, the economic hit is substantial, but businesses, especially speaking about Angola, have really proven to have developed creative ways to get around and to still operate and to digitalize. And so that is really a positive aspect that we should take forward, especially looking at what is usually been said in many fora, that the future is in Africa, or Africa is the future. In that sense, it's I didn't come up with this sentence, but it's widely said globally. So, but I would say it's not just in terms of natural resources, which our countries, like many countries in the world, are rich in natural resources, but definitely there is an opportunity for us to be in the future and ahead in the modernization of processes, but through digitalization. There's definitely a great potential, especially because Angola specifically is a young country where the majority of the population is under the age of 35. So this is really an area where we can capitalize and really take at our own hands the phrase, the future is in Africa, but towards modernization and digitalization. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel.
Thanks a lot, Elisandra. Let's then move to a country where half of the population is definitely not under 35. It's Italy. Going back to Giorgio.
Thank you, Michael. Well, yes, taking inspiration from Caroline, actually, I have one positive lesson and one fear, actually, for the future. The positive lesson, of course, and I'm going to repeat what everyone has said, is digitalization. Italy actually has made a giant leap since the outbreak of the pandemic disease in February, especially I would say in the public sector, such as school and governmental services. So we also have actually, we are discussing a new platform for tax court proceeding, which is about to be launched. So fully online tax court proceedings, but also we actually have experienced many issues. For instance, there was a big, discussion, and also, I mean, the news, the case of so-called clicks days, when tons of people were connecting online at the same time to get a bonus, and the IT system actually crashed at the moment. So, I mean, there is actually a promising way for digitalization, but also there are, actually unfavorable experience. And my fear actually is also I said already before at the beginning of this discussion that I miss a clear vision of what next, in particular, what kind of tax reform will be enacted. For instance, in Italy right now, there is a discussion about tax reform, but actually there is a lot of talks, but nothing in concrete has already put in, for instance, in the next future budget law. So, I mean, a lot of talks, but little in concrete. So that's, yeah.
Thank you, Giorgio. And now I pass the baton for a last time on to Lucas.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you all for this wonderful panel. My last thoughts are going to be really quick. I think that we're going to move with more and more speed towards further digitalization and even use of robotization, artificial intelligence by businesses. And you know, this is a topic that I like to explore in terms of taxation, but it is the future really in the post-pandemic era, which we all hope for very soon. But I think that what we will see in the future is more digitalization on the side of businesses, more digitalization on the side of tax administrations. And as I think Caroline has said, this will require tax professionals to be more aware of both sides, not only the tax side, but also technology and how those two interact. So yeah, those would be my final thoughts. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Lucas. And then last but not least, we go to Dan in DC.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing me onto this great panel. I'll leave on an optimistic note, which is, we've had very good news recently about the progress on a vaccine, and although cases are increasing in the United States right now, I'm optimistic that with the development of a vaccine, we might get very soon to a post-COVID world. And I hope in the recovery that I expect to follow the end of the pandemic, that we'll see investment in things like green energy and restoring our public infrastructure and other key domestic priorities that I think will help make the United States be more dynamic and in the future. The other thing for thinking internationally is the work on digital taxation, both at the UN and the OECD, of course, is very top of mind for us all. And I think that once we get past the COVID-19 kind of pandemic and crisis, that the world will really come back to that and focus on that even more so. And especially for us in the United States, where we already have a pretty robust taxation of outbound investment, thinking about how the OECD Pillar 2 regime might lead back to influencing the US GILTI and CFC and branch taxation rules is really interesting. And so I think there'll be continued development there. And just thinking about the perspective of young tax professionals, I do think that there are a lot of pressures that will change revenue systems and revenue laws in the near future. And, that's a great thing for young professionals, because when the rules change, everybody's starting from the beginning and trying to learn the new rules. And so it's a great opportunity for young professionals to jump in and take the lead. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you all for your final words and for your wrap up. I don't have actually a lot to add to that, to the wisdom that has been shared by you, the panelists. It was great listening in, and it was actually quite fascinating to hear that the next generation is equally dynamic and generally positive and inspired for what's to come. Michael, what do you have as takeaways?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so I was a little bit afraid when we chose this topic. So the disease is terrible, the pandemic and the economic impact is terrible. Should we choose a topic at all? But I actually heard a lot of optimism, also some fears that it's fine, a lot of constructive proposals. So that gives me a lot of confidence for the future. And then hopefully this pandemic will be over soon. We will all be sort of out of our homes again. In my case, out of self-isolation, because I'm the real COVID patient on this panel, as a matter of fact. But I think we all look forward to a bright future and to, of course, meeting each other in person again at future IAN events.
Exactly. Let's shape the future together. And with that, we hand back to the Studio IFA in Rotterdam.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the participants, and in particular the panel and the moderators of this session, for tomorrow's Tax Leaders' View on the Future. As announced earlier, the poster sessions will be now accessible for half an hour, and not tomorrow, but next Monday, the poster sessions will be opened from 2:30 till 3 p.m. Central European Time. At that time, the seminar IFA EU will start in their own virtual room. For this moment, I wish you a pleasant rest of the day and a good weekend. Till Monday.
Dear IFA friends, my name is Edgar Anaya, proud president of the 75th Congress of IFA. And today I'm here to invite you to plan ahead your visit to the Mayan Riviera in the fall of 2022. In less than 2 years, Mexico will host a wonderful and unique Congress for us to show the IFA community the best of the Mexican culture, our rich history and traditions, and our passion for hospitality. The technical sessions have been tailored with truly interesting scientific topics that will certainly be of significance to the international community. All of our sponsors that were ready to celebrate IFA in 2020 and that are joining us in 2022, a special thank you for your trust and commitment. Today, the world has changed, but we will recover and come out stronger. We all want to travel, see our IFA friends, and celebrate a bright new tomorrow. But for now, stay safe. On behalf of IFA Mexico, our best wishes in these uncertain times. And see you in September 2022 in Cancun, Mexico, stronger than ever.